There were a lot of delays, but without further ado, this is the story of 1970s Keith, which I will be reading to you off of my computer, and I will be leaving in the mistakes. Back in the year 2010, there was a 20-year-old man named 1970s Keith. He was given that nickname by his great-grandfather, who was very proud of the fact that Keith liked to collect 1970s memorabilia. An interest in vintage items was a family tradition. Keith's father had collected 1940s memorabilia, and his grandfather had collected 1890s memorabilia back in 1920. His great-grandfather had collected a lot of 1820s memorabilia, and so on. One evening, 1970s Keith was in a record store when something sinister occurred. Keith was in the men's bathroom, washing up when he was snagged away from the sink before he could even dry his hands. Keith soon found that he had gone unconscious, and then he woke up in a strange building, restrained on a table. "I've got you now," shouted a person in the shadows. What are you going to do to me?" said Keith. Suddenly, a mad scientist stepped out from the darkness. "I have kidnapped you," said the scientist, "and I'm hell-bent on figuring the most efficient way to make people's worst nightmares come true." "Oh no, not that," said 1970s Keith. "That's right," said the scientist, his humongous glasses gleaming in Keith's face. "I've injected you with a concoction that will soak into your thoughts and cause you to physically transform into everything you hate the most." "Oh no, anything but that," said 1970s Keith, but it was too late. Soon, Keith grew a permanently wilted flower out of his head because he had a phobia of wilted flowers, and he also grew bat wings because he irrationally thought that bats are the worst animal. Since Keith had always thought that his legs were his most attractive feature, the injection caused his legs to become invisible so that he just looked like some floating douchebag. And then his arms became tiny because tiny arms was what they always called him in gym class after everyone found out he had weak arms. Worst of all, his eyes, while remaining fully functional, got transformed to both look like the letter X, because his first girlfriend broke up with him by mailing him a picture she drew of a man with X's for eyes, along with a handwritten message that read, "These X's are because you're my ex now. Bye forever." "No," said Keith as he looked in the mirror. "I've become a monster." And then the scientist said, "And also, I took all your records and I'm keeping them." "Please, God, why?" said Keith. "Too bad, tiny arms. And now that I've tested my substance on you, I shall fly my entire lair into space. And I'm going to do this to aliens in outer space." "No, not the aliens," said Keith, who loved aliens. But then, without warning, the scientist rendered his victim unconscious yet again, and then abandoned him at a downtown bus stop. So Keith spent the next 4 months trying to go about living his life, looking like an awful freak, without his precious records to listen to. Also, they were previous because they were from before. He tried just listening to that same music online, but all it did was make him really sad. And a well-meaning friend tried to recommend early 2000s techno, but it just didn't feel right, and neither did anything else. His job preparing food at the main cafeteria of his college campus became difficult, what with his literally tiny arms making it hard to hold stuff, and his biggest phobia hanging in front of his face at all times, and his life goals of becoming a pants model seemed grim. One night, Keith was on the phone with his dad, tearfully admitting that he was considering changing his name to 1980s Keith, when his dad said, "Well, hang on a sec. There might be another option." Keith said, "No, Dad. There's no point in anything anymore. Nothing is fun without my collection of 70s records. And anyway, I keep trying to cut the flower off, and it just grows back immediately. And every time I put on a pair of pants, it just turns invisible along with my legs and only becomes visible again once I take them off." And then, "Come on, 1970s Keith," said his dad. "Forget it, Dad. It's hopeless. I'm going to give up on all my dreams and give up on pants and change my major from library science to some other bullshit." "Well, wait, son, your major wasn't even part of this." "There's no point in library science if I can't wear fashionable pants while I'm doing it, Dad." "Son, listen to me. For God's sake, just listen, Keith." Keith quieted down and listened to his father. "Son, when I was your age, I had a nervous breakdown for my own reasons. And my father told me the same thing that his father told him when he had his early 20s nervous breakdown. Your grandfather passed knowledge down to me of how our family traditionally deals with the early 20s nervous breakdown. Mine was caused by a boulder rolling down a hill and landing all over my favorite barn back in the day. And your grandfather's breakdown was caused by the deaths of all his favorite actors and singers on the same day. And your great-granddad, why, his breakdown just kind of happened. We all deal with it somehow, and we all pull through. That's the strength we hold inside our hearts. Is our whole family cursed? Asked Keith. Well, no. But a lot of people have a huge crisis in their early 20s. Yours just happened to be for a really bizarre reason, and I'm sorry you have to go through this, but you don't have to go through it alone. Now here's how my father taught me how to deal with this kind of thing. What you have to do is take some time every day to let yourself feel bad, especially in the beginning. That's important. You lie there in bed for maybe a couple hours, and then think about whatever you need to, and you let those tears just fall out of your face, and if you can't cry, then you sit there and you let those thoughts just happen, but be careful, because if you let it go for too long, you'll make it harder to feel better, so you just try to keep it to a couple hours a day. Then, after you've taken some time to let yourself feel bad, you try to do something that'll make yourself feel a little better. Sometimes you need to get a little creative with that. I remember my favorite thing used to be sitting inside of that barn all day, and that used to be the thing that made me feel better when I was down. When that barn was gone, I didn't know what else to do, so I cried all day. But eventually I realized that sitting inside of museums was also fun. But nothing makes me happier than pants, said Keith, and my specific record collection from the 1970s. Well, son, you can build your record collection back up again. There are literal tons of copies of those same records from the 1970s. But some of those ones still smelled like my ex-girlfriend. And son, that's a whole nother issue for another evening. But I promise you can build your record collection back up again. But what do I do about my weird body, said Keith. His dad said, 1970s, Keith, I promise you that your mother and I will do anything and everything we can to help find someone who can reverse what that evil villain did to you. Remember back when you were little, how your Aunt Sandra didn't think there'd ever be a cure for her disease? Keith remembered being 5 years old and hearing a lot about his Aunt Sandra's condition over time. But then in 1999, they developed a way to stop people's heads from always being on a different part of their body each morning. Son, all sorts of things are possible with the help of medical science. So a couple of seasons passed. In 1970s, Keith began sorting through his emotions, and then he decided to take up sculpture. Sculpture, that's right. Since he was in college anyway, he tried taking a class on it. Lifting the materials and carrying them from place to place was hard, but he found that his extremely small arms were great for detail work. He wasn't that great at the overall practice, and he would never end up doing it professionally, but he did find that he enjoyed it very much. And, every so often, he managed to obtain a record from the 1970s, and he slowly began building his collection back up. This also meant that everyone knew of at least one default thing to try to get him for his birthday. None of the new albums smelled like his ex-girlfriend, and that ended up being a better outcome for his overall mental health. In regards to his physical health, Keith's journey would be a long and complicated one, and it wasn't fun. Doctors weren't entirely sure what to do with him at first, but after a while, his family found some specialists who gave them a decent amount of hope for his future as a lover of pants and normal eyes. Keith also continued experimenting with other music. And he found that while early 2000s techno wasn't his style, post-2009 techno was something he quite enjoyed. And although nobody in his family ever called him 2010 Techno Keith, there were a couple of friends from his junior year of college who would, and he found that he actually kind of liked that. And then roll credits, because I have ending themes to all my shit now, just like all of you. The end.